So instead of being a very ostensibly pretentious writer, I'm going to be a slightly less pretentious writer and have water instead of tea or coffee. And I also don't have a skull, but I have Eddie. So, what are we discussing today? So I know this has been a bit of a trend as of late to dunk on this channel called The Second Story. She's been promoted to me all throughout my YouTube feed. She is apparently an author. Her name is Hillary Lane, and I wanted to specifically discuss her video entitled "Fanfiction Has Destroyed Writing and Everything Else." Quite the excessive and exceptional claim, in which she castigates all of fanfiction, the entirety of it, as the sole or primary contributor to the degradation of modern literature, critical thinking, and by extension, morality and the state of society itself. Now, for quite a momentous claim such as that, you would think she would have some sources, right? Surely she wouldn't just quote random statistic that she pulled out of absolutely nowhere, right? However, within her rant, she does bring up a lot of very interesting topics that I think can be good jumping-off points for further exploration that Hillary herself deigns to further explicate, such as the history of fan fiction from where it originated, the role that capitalism and consumerism plays on traditional publishing and what gets published and distributed commercially, society and cultural influences, literary patterns and mainstream trends, etc. I'd suggest it's because actual nuance and intellectual curiosity are necessities for these types of discussions, and Hillary's rhetoric can be summarized as fanfiction bad because it's all smut and perversion or worse. Representation. So personally, with my experience, I don't really know much about fanfiction. I wrote a fanfiction probably in the early 2000s about Harry Potter with one of my best friends at the time. We were like, I don't know, emo goth students at the school. It was a thing. But I've never actually been on AO3, nor any of its predecessors or lateral cousins, per se. So I'm not necessarily the right person here on the internet to defend it from the specific criticisms that Hillary levies against it. So that's why I'm going to recommend a swath of other creators who have reacted to many of Hillary's videos, not just this one, pertaining to fanfiction. And yeah, they delve into it and give their varied and very exceptionally well-researched perspectives on the merits and issues surrounding fanfiction and its role within society. So, you might ask, what drew me specifically to make this video? And what specific angle do I want to take? Well, it was Hillary's repeated dismissal of emotions, or the value of appealing to and satisfying the emotional needs of the author and the audience. It's really just that I've noticed this trend with people whose perspectives seemingly align with Hillary's, if you kind of get my drift, that there is this familiar temerity and hubris from which they presume that detachment or simply not caring about a current issue somehow grants this exceptional clarity to evaluate said problems from an unbiased and more rational perspective. This is incredibly a flawed premise and just a blatantly forced correlation with no actual substantive, can't say that word, evidence to begin with. Yet I've heard it reiterated from innumerable different people from a wide variety of backgrounds, basically for over a decade now, and most commonly among certain demographics that are very likely not to demonstrate empathy, nor be receptive to the reality that some groups experience pain and marginalization. So my particular focus is to unpack the socio-political biases that Hillary represents and her false conceptualization of emotions and their representation in literature as self-indulgence. She uses that phrase a lot in her video, which she mendaciously blames for the simplification of literature, current literature, and the prevalence of stories that value ideas and feelings over good narratives. Whatever that means. So, let's start with emotion, shall we? So, unlike Hillary, Let's forgo pretense and nebulous language intended to obfuscate and create plausible deniability on our positions. Hillary and I are both biased. Our perceptions of reality and our identities within the framework of our existence are influenced by our environments and the society and culturally inculcated messaging that raised us, to put it simply. However, like I previously said, like many others who are dealing with the same kind of insufferable propensities, such as her, she fallaciously attributes her lack of sensitivity or acceptance of changing cultural climates and norms to having an intrinsically rational standpoint. Emotions or empathy, I've noticed that as well, that term empathy has been dragged through the mud, per se, but they've been leveraged in general by the right to infer a logical superiority that is unbiased or unmoved by arguments suffused with feelings. This is inevitably wrong from any metric, as feelings are human and pervasive in the determination of morality and moral valuations and judgments. And they seem to always forget that, like, disgust is an emotion, anger, frustration, all these things, these more negative emotions, they're emotions too. To feel is to be alive, to be present. To assert transcendence of that is not only intrinsically false, but it's really not useful in a society where objective rationality and morality don't exist, where it is extremely reductive to view all issues out of their context from a narrow personal framework to justify the righteousness of subjective behaviors and beliefs. Now, I know from other videos that Hillary has done, I believe it's the one pertaining to villains and villainy, that she has this conceptualization of right and wrong, of moral and immoral, good and bad, that is unwavering and presumably very defined and encodified by something. I want to say religion, but that hasn't been confirmed by her, so I don't want to make any kinds of statements on that. However, she does seem to be in rigid adherence to the adumbrated list of what behaviors are acceptable to her and what constitutes righteousness or goodness or evil. And she also perceives evil as the lack of good, and it's just, you can watch that video, it's very strange, to be honest. And I know a lot of people will take umbrage with my conceptualization of both rationality and morality as being intrinsically objective, and that's fine. I suppose it's a discussion all in itself that I really don't want to delve into. I just kind of wanted to bring up the idea of how emotions factor into our determination, because people like Hillary will profess it's not emotional, what's right is right, what's wrong is wrong, it's predefined, and as such, there's no room for discussion. That empathy and emotional reasoning has no value because it cannot be factored in decisions that appertain to whether something is moral or immoral. And of course, I disagree with that. I think everything can be determined on a case-by-case basis. So, personally, to touch upon that issue, I think emotions do factor into what is both legal and rational and moral, and what has been determined as such is affected by emotions and our past and how we were raised. To say, oh, it's just this, like, it's Hammurabi's code, it's something that's been pre-written, to say you're in rigid adherence to that and therefore that's it kind of exculpates you from taking any kind of role in determining what's moral, in a sense. Like, I don't have to evaluate my society, I don't have to critically think about how morality changes through time, how it's different in different cultures. I don't have to do any of that kind of thinking. I don't have to hold myself accountable, because all I have to do is adhere to these rules and not think or care or do anything else. And, you know, I think that's obviously an incredibly dense and incorrect kind of perspective, and it also takes away any personal emotions that do factor into these decisions, because they could say, oh, it's just the rules, I'm just following, but you follow the rules because you feel that they're right, because they uphold your personal perspectives and beliefs. That, to me, is emotional reasoning. It's what you want, it's what you feel. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's substantiated by actual evidence or what has proven to be best or most salubrious or most beneficial to society itself. And really, any situation can be kind of spun subconsciously or intentionally in accordance with the speaker's pre-existing viewpoints to substantiate their pre-existing personal narrative. So I think the more we are self-aware of that, of our personal biases and propensities, and the more we are held accountable for that, and the more perspectives and data and information that we accrue, the closer we can come to mutual understanding and asymptotically reach a collective truth and morality. So yeah, devaluation of empathy doesn't give you clarity intrinsically. Empathy is nothing more than a tool or an implement of understanding that can remove traditional barriers and mental blocks, and it opens up the possibility of hearing multitudinous perspectives and personal truths. And from this accruement of differing ideas and knowledge, growth and betterment can precipitate. Hopefully. I'm not a philosopher, so that aside, those are just my personal ideas appertaining to emotion, so you understand where I'm coming from when I move on to the next subject, which is the implementation and inclusion of emotions in literature and how much I think they're valuable, which seemingly Hillary doesn't. Because if you think about it, emotions are in service to a story, and I really cannot conceptualize an effective narrative that is devoid of any emotional underpinning. And without that intrinsic humanity, you are essentially just going through the motions of story beats. You're just hitting it, and there's no tension, there's no weight, and there's no meaning underlying any of it, because forming resonant connections with all of the characters imbues value and significance beyond just trying to tell a story where a character goes from A to B, not internally, but physically. Both investment and immersion in your story are born from having empathy for the characters and making the audience care. So one thing that Hillary does throughout her video, which I know a lot of people kind of mention as well, is her vague language. And I do wish in this particular video about fanfiction that she would better explain her point in arguing that satisfying the emotional needs of an author and an audience negatively affects the quality of the work. Saying that means nothing to me. Like, what are these infringing emotional needs specifically? What are they? And how do they differ from an author just performing a detailed anatomization or character work that is necessary to write a complex and interesting cast? How does the inclusion of these feelings compromise a story's integrity? Can we get some examples on that? So, let's try to understand and unpack her vague language. What is she really saying? I'd like to give her the benefit of the doubt and assume that she's, cognizant of the integral role that emotions play in literature, and that she can't seriously believe that Shakespeare lacks emotions, right? That Shakespeare is good because it isn't emotional? Really? To be or not to be, I defy you, stars. How sour sweet music is when time is broken, no proportion kept, so it is in the music of men's lives. Here I have a daintiness of ear to check time broke in a disordered string, but for the concord of my own state and time, I had not an ear to hear my true time broke. I wasted time. Now doth time waste me. Super rational guy, Richard II. totally unemotional. So this is what I think Hillary is doing and what she's trying to say. She is basically conflating emotionally evocative aspects of modern literature with her understanding of current liberalism or leftist ideology. She thinks that capitulation or adoption of cultural sensitivities and trends that's present often in fan fiction, that it's done solely in order to appeal to that audience that has a tendency to be more, as she would probably put it, woke. Therefore, any inclusion of representation, self-inserted characters, or emotional and moral themes is automatically dismissed and labeled as self-indulgence. Not because, of course, she disagrees with the political stance of messaging, of course not, but rather because she thinks it's resulting in poor literature, somehow. So, I will give her a little half a point here. I will give some credence to that, because do some stories sacrifice quality and subtlety and complexity on the altar of self-important propagandizing in order to influence their readership to provide a safe space to affirm existing perspectives on socio-political issues of our time? Yeah. Like, is this specific to the left? Hell no. Is it the intention of all fan fiction? Especially self-inserted narratives? No. And as a result, this is where her personal blindness to her own biases becomes even more evident in the video. So I've noticed this a lot from many conservatives, but they seem to believe that any demonstrable exploration of modern themes or view of the modern times is automatically considered trite or shallow commentary that's foisted upon the audience, which overshadows every other aspect of the work. When the lesson is louder than the journey, a creative piece can feel more like a high school PSA than interesting and enjoyable literature. I will grant her that. That is kind of fair. Yeah, I do generally agree with that. Like, even if your opinions align with some of the media that you're watching, sometimes it can be so heavy-handed in its conveyance that even if you, like, 100% agree with the message, sometimes you're like, you just roll your eyes and you're like, please, no. You just kind of cringe because it's so obvious. It just, like, fustigates you on the head with it. And it's not fun anymore. Especially considering how the work that you're currently enjoying is marketed. It could come out of nowhere. Like, you could be reading this awesome, like, fantasy story, and then suddenly a character just goes into a multi-page monologue about how saving the rainforest is important. Yeah, I grew up in the 90s, so that was, like, our big thing back then for some reason. I mean, some saving the rainforest media was good. I love Fern Gully. Oh, toxic love. Yeah, it's great. But yeah, it can be very interruptive to the enjoyment of the story itself and feel kind of out of character depending on how the character was initially established. So yeah, I get it. Messages can be forced. They can be annoying. They can be utterly inefficacious in changing hearts and minds if they're done sloppily. I think Hillary and I can agree on that. However, let's say it all together now. All art is political, even without trying to be. Some writers are merely just influenced by their actual life events and just want to discuss or reflect what's going on in their lives, an honest depiction of what they experienced. Analyses or recollections of reality are also undermined and excoriated by these types of people or conservatives, no matter how truthful they happen to be. So it's extremely obvious that this ire, this frustration, is not equally applied to every narrative with a realistic historical or biographical lens. I mean, right? Like, stories that feature the lives of POC, LGBTQ+, women, etc., they're intrinsically political. But the stories of straight, white males are considered the norm, baseline, and don't incur the same vile reaction. And yeah, this is something that I've thought about quite a lot, actually, that in the narratives that do present the stories of straight white men, that regardless of like the kind of broad economic situations, the interpersonal relationships, the political turmoil, the wars, the cultural zeitgeist, the personal mindset or beliefs of these white male protagonists, we are all expected to still distill humanity and seek that connective resonance, no matter how different their lives are from our own, and how different their identities are from our own. In essence, why is it self-indulgent to have accurate representation when said representation is from oppressed or marginalized groups, while the white man's burdens become simply literature? Hillary's disdain is quite disgusting, as is her hypocrisy here. So given that fanfiction promotes the creation and promulgation of all sorts of unique narratives and personal opinions, the hatred and demonization of the platform by people like Hillary becomes obvious and explicable in its rationale. It's just the gall of these people to confidently step outside their little hermetically sealed right-wing propaganda bubble just long enough to criticize the very platforms that offer democratized access to very perspectives that traditional publishers have historically ignored. It's ignorant at best, and every ist word you can think of at worst. Like, it isn't bloody indulgence to have the mere opportunity to enjoy stories that feature experiences that have overwhelmingly been silenced or suppressed, or that happen to pose difficult or uncomfortable conversations about the social climate. And just as a little offhanded thought, considering the side of the political spectrum that is more actively engaged in censorship and book banning of any story deemed inappropriate by the arbitrary caprices of pundits or people in charge, I would argue that it's people more like Hillary who are the self-indulgent ones, right? The fragile ones who demand constant representation and characterization and whine when the lead doesn't look or sound like them. Wasn't there that meme once that about like the Harry Potter Dudley meme involving white male protagonists where Dudley's like 35 white male protagonists last year I had 36. That's insane. That's how they sound. So it does seem intentional and insidious because they're relegating these stories to otherness, to a state of otherness, or categorizing marginalized people as political intrinsically, or emotional, or self-indulgent. And in doing so, you're effectively stripping these narratives of their humanity, of their truth, of the value in their scrutiny or presentation of life as these people have experienced it in truth. It is denialism masquerading as rationality. Because if a story challenges your worldview, why engage critically when you can dismiss it as illogical self-servicing or identity politics? So, what is identity politics exactly? Because I've always been kind of confused as to what constitutes identity politics. It was just a very nebulous kind of term in the way that it was stated and applied. So how does this manifest in creative works? So firstly, I will reiterate, why are white male stories not considered a form of identity politics? It's insane. To offer an explanation to my own question, my thought is that stories that represent and explore the lives of white men have been allowed historically to be written and popularized and shared. They're lauded as high art or the zenith of literary achievement, and we are encouraged and even forced in educational or academic settings to analyze every facet of these personal experiences that the role of being a white man, that identity plays in their specific navigation of life and the concomitant expectations that society has of them as a result of being that way is often a prevalent theme. they are considered the default human, and the sheer multitude of available stories written by various men from all walks of life, it allows there to be variety, that some can delve into identity politics and explore what being a man means, and others can focus on other themes that maybe are more specific to that person's experience. But the point is that they have that breadth and that opportunity to have that diversity. So conversely, we lack stories that feature people who deviate from that said baseline. Many authors, therefore, have a desire to fill that void and share their perspectives. It's really quite easy to understand, Hillary. It really is. Like, even from a capitalistic framework, which I know you guys love, people occasionally want to read narratives and support narratives that directly resonate or represent the similar experiences that they have had, and will look for and will monetarily promote authors that can provide that specific voice that they're looking for. So why, then, is fan fiction maligned for fulfilling that emotional need in an audience to see themselves in art, to have their lives and their identities included for once, when mainline media historically has fallen short of that and has not? There's validity, Hillary, to that desire, to the importance of feeling understood and connected to other people and seen, and just generally less alone in a society intent to homogenize the human experiences under the category or auspices of the straight white male identity. So the last part of this conversation I want to address is the argument that the stories are just less interesting when the sole focus is on how a character's identity impacts their life and how they navigate society. So firstly, I'd say, if that's your perspective, that's a you problem, and maybe something to explore in therapy as to why you lack empathy and can only be drawn to care about characters in which you readily and easily see yourself. I'm obviously not a therapist, but I'd wager it's indicative of some defensiveness and a general unwillingness to accept the veracity of societal stratification and oppression in the past and resonating and propagating outwards to today. But that's another sociological discussion, and I don't have time to get into that. But I will give credence, hear me out, that the types of narratives that feature marginalized people that actually do make it to the mainstream do have a tendency to have a common theme. And there's this expectation that it will center around their identity. And this is often independent of the genre itself. So I can talk as a woman because that's my identity. But so from that perspective, I get it. Like when a film like trailer comes out and it showcases a female protagonist, for instance, the automatic assumption that a lot of people have, and even that I have, is that her identity as a woman will be integrated into the story somehow. And as I mentioned before, depending on how it's done, it can actually be annoyingly distracting and interruptive to the larger plot at play. Sometimes I don't want that. Like, it really depends, right? If a narrative is intended to be a realistic piece detailing the life of the female protagonist, then yeah, like I can say as a woman myself that being physiologically and societally seen and defined as such has unequivocally influenced my life and my development in impactful and irrevocable ways. So any angle on a piece that would tell my life story, not that anyone would, care enough to do that, but they would be remiss and inaccurate to avoid that major component. But simultaneously, I will admit that female identity is only one part of who I am. and a truly detailed examination of me as a person will include this totality and depth. So, is it wrong to have a fully feminist take on my life, or is that forcing a predetermined liberal framework from which to analyze my experiences? I think that both are valid, and I think there should be room for both. It's important to have stories that showcase marginalization for the sake of finding resonance with other people in your kind of identity group that have had to contend for the same thing, and also even outside to help educate people on the societal and cultural issues at hand, and that had and still have a very profound effect on how people navigate existence that they're not cognizant of. But then on the other hand, not all stories featuring marginalized people have to focus on and highlight their historic and current oppression as a major theme. Personally, I enjoy fictionalized works and worlds that assume gender equality, like, for example, where patriarchy never existed in the society and all characters are written as people first, without their specific identity as a woman manifesting or necessarily influencing them or their lives at all. Such stories can be a really nice escape sometimes, not to always have to confront the problems that you deal with every day, right? So the thing is, you would think that Hillary and her ilk would agree with that, right? Like, no conversation at all about inequality. It's the assumption that they navigate life with, so you think they would like that, right? But that's still not good enough for them, because people like Hillary then complain that fictionalized worlds or versions of our own society are now unrealistic for daring to show marginalized groups where they may not have been as present or as visible historically. Something like Bridgerton, which I believe Hillary does profess annoys her. So what does she want then? No woke discussions or themes depicting real-life issues? But then at the same time, just enough realism to avoid inclusivity and diverse representation at all. I think Hillary just doesn't want to be reminded that marginalized people exist in the first place. So, my main takeaway is that fan fiction offers the chance at finding stories that achieve both ends of this kind of spectrum, where more options and opportunities exist for people to share their stories and find stories that better represent them. And the more people that do this and have the ability to do this for free, that's a huge component of it, but the more variety and thematic variance the audience can choose to engage from. So whether that be if you want to see a very harsh and grounded, gritty take on real life and oppression and what it means, or something that's a little bit more nuanced and subtle and discusses the issues from a more metaphorical or allegorical angle and also features other plot lines and themes, or you want to go and just completely ignore it entirely and showcase an idealized society, that is up to you as a consumer of media to decide. So as long as there's a space for people to write these stories and to find these stories and to have access to these stories if they want, I can't see anything wrong with that.